It was one of those mornings when the sky looked like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or not. The streets were wet but not flooded, and the air smelled of coffee, car smoke, and damp leaves. Inside a small corner cafe, a young woman named Clara wiped the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. She didn't mind the routine. The smell of roasted beans and warm pastries was comforting. This little cafe had become her second home ever since she started working there 2 years ago. The place wasn't fancy, just a few tables, a humming coffee machine, and a bell that jingled whenever someone came through the door. Most of the regulars came in for their morning fix before work. Some greeted her with a smile. Others barely looked up from their phones. She knew their usual orders by heart. The years turned into decades, and the story of the Ellis Hope Foundation became a quiet legend around the world. Generations grew up hearing about the woman who turned a simple cup of coffee into a movement of compassion. Many thought it was only a story, a nice tale told to inspire goodness. Few realized that it had all been real. Clara had lived a long, full life. She never cared for fame, but her kindness had reached far beyond what she could ever have imagined. As time passed, she chose to live quietly in a small cottage by the sea, away from the noise of the city. The foundation ran smoothly under new leadership, built on the same principles she had established: humility, hope, and humanity. The cottage was peaceful. Every morning, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the waves rise and fall like a heartbeat. Sometimes she thought about the past, not with sadness but with gratitude. She often whispered to herself, "It all began with kindness," as if to remind her heart of how far a small moment could travel. One breezy afternoon, she received a letter from the foundation's new director. It was handwritten, something she appreciated deeply in a world now filled with screens and messages. "Dear Miss Clara, we wanted you to know that next month marks the 50th anniversary of the Ellis Hope Foundation. We are hosting a celebration in your honor. None of this would exist without your heart and vision. Please come, even if just for a short while. Everyone would love to see you again." Clara smiled softly as she read the letter. 50 years. She couldn't quite believe it. What had once been a promise between two people had become a global legacy. She folded the letter carefully, placed it on her desk, and looked out toward the ocean. The sky was full of color, orange, pink, and gold. She decided she would go. A few weeks later, she arrived at the city hall where the event was held. The building had been decorated beautifully, filled with people from all walks of life: students, volunteers, doctors, teachers, and community workers from around the world. Each one had been touched by the foundation in some way. As she entered, a wave of quiet excitement spread through the crowd. People turned, clapping and smiling warmly. Clara, now in her 80s, walked slowly with the help of a cane, her steps steady and graceful. A young volunteer offered her arm, but she smiled and said, "I'm all right, dear. I've been walking this path for a long time." The director met her near the stage, his eyes filled with respect. "Miss Clara," he said, "I can't tell you how honored we are to have you here. None of us would be standing here if it weren't for your kindness all those years ago." Clara smiled humbly. It wasn't just me. It was Harold. It was everyone who believed that kindness still mattered. The ceremony began with stories. Stories from people who had been helped by the foundation over the decades. A teacher from Kenya spoke about how her school was built because of their support. A young man from Brazil shared how he had received a scholarship that changed his life. An elderly woman from the Philippines told the crowd how the foundation helped rebuild her village after a storm. Each story carried the same thread. One act of kindness had led to another, and then another, until it became a chain that stretched across the world. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she stood at the podium, holding a small note in her trembling hands. The room fell silent. "I never thought any of this would happen," she began softly. "When I offered that cup of coffee to an old man on a rainy morning, I didn't think it would change anything. But kindness doesn't always show its power right away. Sometimes it takes years to see the difference it makes." She looked around the room, her eyes gentle but filled with light. "I used to believe that helping one person wasn't enough, but that man and Harold taught me that kindness is never small. It grows quietly like roots under the ground until one day you realize it's become a forest. I want all of you to remember this. You never know whose heart you might touch or what story you might unlock with one small act of love." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the crowd rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces glowing with emotion. Clara smiled and nodded, grateful but humble as always. After the ceremony, people lined up to meet her, each one thanking her personally. Some brought photos of projects she had inspired, others simply wanted to hold her hand. Later that evening, when most people had left, Clara wandered outside the hall. The air was cool and the city lights sparkled like stars. She walked slowly to the small garden beside the building where a bronze statue stood, the same one of Harold on the bench holding a coffee cup. Someone had placed fresh flowers beside it. She smiled and sat down on the nearby bench, resting her cane beside her. A young girl no older than 10 walked over shyly holding a small notebook. "Are you Miss Clara?" she asked. Clara nodded. "I am." "What's your name, dear?" "My teacher told us your story," the girl said excitedly. "We read it in class. She said you helped millions of people just by being kind." Clara laughed softly. "That's very sweet, but I didn't do it alone. I just started it." The rest of the world kept it going. The girl thought for a moment, then said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Clara leaned forward and said kindly, "Then start today. Be kind to someone. It doesn't have to be big. Even a smile can change someone's day." The girl grinned, nodded, and ran back to her parents. Clara watched her go, feeling a quiet warmth fill her heart. As the night deepened, she looked up at the sky and whispered, "Harold, I hope you're seeing this. Look what your kindness has done." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, almost as if answering her. That night, back in her cottage, Clara sat by the window again, the moonlight spilling across her desk. She opened the silver locket she always kept close. Inside was the same photo of Harold's daughter, faded but still clear, and the same message, "Be kind anyway." She touched the words lightly and smiled. "We did it," she said softly. The next morning, the sun rose over the ocean, painting the waves in gold. A fisherman walking along the beach noticed something resting on a rock near the water, a silver locket gleaming in the light. He picked it up, opened it, and smiled at the message inside. He looked around, saw no one, and quietly slipped it into his pocket. Later that day, when he returned to the village cafe, he placed the locket in a small wooden box by the counter with a handwritten note that read, "For whoever finds this, remember to be kind anyway." No one knew where the locket had come from, but the note stayed there. Travelers who stopped by would often pick it up, read it, smile, and leave something kind behind. A meal paid for, a letter, a small act of generosity. The spirit of kindness continued just as it always had, and though Clara's time on earth eventually came to an end, her story never did. Her life became a quiet reminder that sometimes the simplest moments, a cup of coffee, a kind word, a small smile, can ripple across generations. Somewhere, in 1,000 different places, someone was being kind at that very moment, not knowing that the spark that inspired them had begun long ago, with one woman, one act, and one belief that kindness, no matter how small, can change everything. Man in the gray coat liked a black Americano. The lady with the red scarf always asked for extra foam. Life was predictable, steady, and sometimes a little dull, but safe. That morning, something different caught her eye. Through the foggy glass window, she noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench across the street. He looked out of place, thin, tired, and soaked from the drizzle. People walked past him without even noticing. A few glanced his way but quickly looked down, pretending not to see him. Clara hesitated for a moment, watching him rub his hands together for warmth. Something about him tugged at her heart. The bell rang and another customer walked in, shaking off the rain. Clara took the order, made the coffee, and forced a polite smile. But her eyes kept drifting back to the man outside. He hadn't moved in nearly an hour. When the cafe grew quiet again, she walked over to the window, pulled out a paper cup, and filled it with steaming hot coffee. She wrapped it carefully with a napkin, slipped an extra cookie beside it, and headed out the door. The wind hit her face, sharp and cold. She hurried across the street and stopped in front of the man. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to approach him. His eyes were pale, and his face carried the kind of wrinkles that come from more than just age. Perhaps from loneliness, too. "Here," Clara said softly, handing him the cup. It's just coffee, but it's warm. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at the cup like he wasn't sure what to do with it. Then slowly, he reached out and took it. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice gravelly but gentle. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said with a smile. "But you look like you could use it." He gave a small nod, still holding the cup with both hands as if afraid it might disappear. She turned to leave, but then she hesitated. The rain was falling harder now. "You can come inside if you want," she said. "It's warmer there." The man seemed uncertain. "I don't want to trouble anyone." "It's no trouble," Clara said quickly. "You'll just sit for a bit. No one will mind." After a long pause, he got up slowly, clutching the cup like a treasure. They crossed the street together, and she held the cafe door open for him. A few customers looked up briefly, curious, but soon went back to their laptops and newspapers. Clara guided the man to a quiet corner near the window. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. He shook his head. "The coffee's more than enough." But she brought him a warm muffin anyway, pretending it was a mistake order. He smiled faintly when she placed it in front of him. "You're kind," he said. "Not many are these days," she shrugged. "Maybe they're just busy. Everyone's got something going on." He looked at her for a moment, studying her expression. "And what's keeping you busy?" She laughed softly. "Work, bills, trying to make it to next month without losing my mind." He chuckled, a quiet, raspy sound. "You remind me of someone," he said, more to himself than to her. "Someone who used to say the same thing." "Someone from your family?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. "A long time ago," he said finally. "But that's another story." Clara didn't push. She'd learned that some people carried stories too heavy to share with strangers. Still, something about his tone made her wonder who he really was. He stayed for nearly an hour, sipping his coffee slowly. When he got up to leave, he reached into his worn coat pocket and pulled out a few coins. "For the coffee," he said. Clara shook her head. "It's on the house. Don't worry about it." He smiled again, the kind of smile that seemed to hold gratitude too deep for words. "Then thank you," he said softly. "Not just for the coffee." After he left, Clara felt strangely thoughtful. She didn't even know his full name, yet she couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about his calmness, his careful way of speaking, that stayed with her. Over the next few days, he returned, always around the same time, always ordering the same drink. Each time they talked a little more. He told her about the cities he'd visited, the people he'd met, and how the world seemed to move faster now than it used to. Clara told him about her dream of opening her own cafe one day, a place where people could feel seen, no matter who they were. He listened intently, asking questions that made her feel like her dreams actually mattered. It was strange, but she began to look forward to those quiet mornings when he would appear at the door, rain or shine. One afternoon, she noticed he wasn't there. The bench across the street was empty. She told herself maybe he'd gone somewhere else. Maybe he'd found a better spot to stay dry. But when he didn't come for several days, a small worry started to grow in her chest. A week passed before she saw him again. This time he looked even thinner, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cup. "You've been gone," she said gently. "I had some things to take care of," he replied, smiling faintly. "Did you miss me?" "Of course," she said with a laugh. "You're my favorite customer." He laughed too, but it sounded tired. "I'm glad to hear that." That day he seemed quieter than usual. When he finished his drink, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note. He placed it on the counter. "For you," he said. "What's this?" "Just something I wanted to say." Before she could open it, he was already walking toward the door. She thought he would be back the next morning, but he never returned. When she finally opened the note that night, she found only a few words written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Clara sat on her bed, staring at the note for a long time. She didn't understand why it made her eyes sting, but it did. She kept it in her wallet after that, tucked safely between a few old receipts. Days turned into weeks and life went on. She still worked at the cafe, still greeted the regulars, still wiped the counter 100 times a day. But something inside her had changed. Every time she saw someone sitting alone, she thought of that man, his quiet voice, his grateful eyes, the way he said thank you like it truly meant something. Sometimes she caught herself glancing out the window, half expecting to see him sitting on that same bench again, but he never came back. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that this simple act of kindness, a cup of coffee given on a rainy morning, had set something in motion far beyond her understanding. Somewhere out there, that moment had awakened an old heart, stirred forgotten memories, and begun a chain of events that would soon turn her entire world upside down. But for now, she had no idea. All she knew was that kindness, even the smallest kind, had a quiet power. And though she didn't know it yet, that single gesture had already begun to unlock a story that would change not only her life, but touch millions who would one day hear it. When Clara opened the letter, her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't sure what to expect. The lawyer had just told her that the old man she once knew, the quiet, gentle one who used to visit her cafe, had passed away. It didn't feel real. Her mind kept flashing back to his soft voice, his warm smile, and that note he once left her that said, "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Now here she was, sitting in a law office with polished wooden walls and a desk that smelled faintly of lemon polish, holding a letter written by his own hand. The lawyer had said it was meant for her personally. She took a deep breath and carefully unfolded the envelope. The handwriting was neat and steady, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who took their time with words. "Dear Clara," it began, "if you're reading this, it means my time here has come to an end. But before I go, there's something I need you to know." Her eyes moved slowly across the page as the words unfolded a story she never could have imagined. "The name you knew me by wasn't my real one. My full name is Harold Ellis. Years ago, I built a business empire that made me one of the wealthiest men in the country. People called me a genius, a visionary, a self-made man. But behind those titles was a lonely soul who lost everything that truly mattered." Clara blinked, her heart pounding. She looked up at the lawyer in shock. He was that Harold Ellis? The billionaire who disappeared?" The lawyer nodded gently. "Yes. He lived a very private life after retiring from his company. Most people assumed he had gone overseas. Few knew where he actually was." Clara's breath caught. The man who had sat quietly in her cafe every morning, dressed in a worn-out coat, was someone the world thought had vanished. She looked back down at the letter, unable to stop reading. "Many years ago," it continued, "I had a daughter. She was my light, my reason to smile. She had the same kindness I saw in you, but I wasn't the kind of father she deserved. I cared more about meetings and money than I did about her laughter. My wife warned me that I was losing her, but I didn't listen. By the time I realized what I had done, it was too late. They left, and soon after, I lost them both in a car accident. That broke me in ways words can't describe." Clara could almost hear his voice in her head, the calm, gentle tone he always spoke in. She could picture his eyes filled with quiet sadness. "I walked away from everything after that," the letter went on. "I gave up my business, my home, my name. I wandered from place to place, trying to find peace, but I never did. I spent years believing there was no good left in the world, that people only cared about what they could take. Then one rainy morning you handed me a cup of coffee." Clara's lips trembled as she continued reading. "You didn't ask for anything. You didn't know who I was. You just saw someone cold and tired and decided to be kind. That small moment reminded me of something I thought I had lost forever. The simple goodness of the human heart. You didn't just give me coffee that day. You gave me hope." Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, at least not in her mind. It was just a cup of coffee, a kind gesture to someone who looked lonely. But for him, it had meant everything. The letter continued. "After that day, I began to write again. I began to think about my daughter, about how she once said, 'Dad, the smallest kindness can change someone's world.' I never understood what she meant until you proved it. You helped me see that it wasn't too late to do something good with what was left of my life." Clara swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she turned the page. "You may have already learned that I left something for you, but please understand it's not a reward. It's a thank you, a chance for you to continue what you already started. You reminded me that wealth isn't measured by what's in the bank, but by how we use it to make life better for others. I've made arrangements for a foundation to be built in my daughter's name. You will be the one to lead it. I trust you completely because kindness like yours can't be taught. It lives in the heart." She stopped reading for a moment, wiping away her tears. The room felt quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock. One of the most emotional moments came when she was invited to speak at a charity gala. The hall was filled with wealthy donors, business owners, and celebrities. Cameras flashed as she stepped on stage, nervous but composed. "I used to be a barista," she began with a smile. The crowd quieted. "And one day I gave an old man a cup of coffee. I didn't know who he was. I just saw someone who needed kindness. That moment changed my life forever." Harold Ellis wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man searching for forgiveness. He found peace through compassion. And I learned that sometimes the smallest gesture can create the biggest ripple. The audience applauded, many of them visibly moved. Some had tears in their eyes. Clara stepped down from the stage with a quiet heart. She knew Harold would have been proud. After the event, she stood outside on the balcony looking at the night sky. The city lights sparkled below like stars fallen to earth. She felt a deep sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, everything made sense. A gentle breeze brushed against her face, and she whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Somewhere deep inside, she felt that he was listening. Weeks later, she visited the cemetery where Harold was laid to rest. His grave was simple, just like he wanted it. No grand statue or marble monument, just his name, his years, and one short line. He found peace through kindness. Clara placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and sat quietly. "I think you'd like what we've built," she said softly. "Your daughter's name is everywhere now, and people are being helped every day. You're still changing lives, Harold, just like you wanted." She stayed until sunset, the golden light wrapping everything in warmth. When she stood up to leave, she looked around at the quiet cemetery and smiled through her tears. Life had come full circle. The man who once thought his life had no meaning had found redemption, and the woman who once felt invisible had found her purpose. It had all started with one small act of kindness, proof that even in a world rushing by, a single moment of compassion could unlock something extraordinary. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm for Clara. The foundation had grown stronger than she could have imagined. What began as a single promise had now turned into a movement that touched lives across the country. Every day brought letters of thanks from people she had never met, families who received help, students who got scholarships, and workers who finally found hope again. Clara still lived a simple life. Despite all the fame and attention, she never saw herself as anything more than an ordinary person. She still woke up early, made her own coffee, and preferred walking to work instead of driving. Sometimes people recognized her on the street and thanked her for what she was doing. She always smiled and said the same thing. "It wasn't me. It started with kindness." One chilly morning, she arrived at the foundation's office to find the staff setting up for a small event. Today marked 1 year since the official launch of the Ellis Hope Foundation, and they planned to celebrate by opening a new community center. The building had been renovated from an old library, and its walls were painted bright yellow and white. The center would serve as a place for children to learn, for families to get support, and for the elderly to feel less alone. As she looked around the hall filled with banners and balloons, Clara felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She thought of Harold, how he would have smiled at the sight of people coming together for something good. Before the ceremony began, she walked to a quiet corner and opened the silver locket he had left her. Inside was the same small photograph of his daughter and the words, "Be kind anyway." She whispered softly, "We did it." Later that afternoon, the ceremony began. Local families, volunteers, and donors filled the room. The air buzzed with laughter, chatter, and the sound of children running around with excitement. When it was time for Clara to speak, she stepped onto the small stage holding the locket in her hand. "Today isn't just about a new building," she said with a smile. "It's about a dream that kindness can truly change lives. A man once taught me that no amount of money means anything unless it's used to make someone else's world brighter. He believed in compassion and forgiveness and in hope. That belief lives on here, through all of you." The audience applauded warmly. Some people even wiped tears from their eyes. After the event ended, Clara stayed behind to help clean up. As she picked up a few stray cups from the floor, she saw an elderly woman watching her from the doorway. The woman smiled gently and walked over. "You must be Clara," the woman said softly. "I've been wanting to meet you." Clara smiled politely. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The woman nodded. Actually, I came to thank you. My son got one of your scholarships. He's the first in our family to go to college. We didn't think it was possible, but your foundation made it happen. Clara's eyes softened. That's wonderful. He must be so proud. He is, the woman said. But I think you should know he's not just studying for himself. He says he wants to come back and teach here one day so other kids like him can have a chance too. That made Clara smile wider. That's exactly what kindness does. It spreads. The woman reached out and squeezed her hand. You've changed more lives than you know, dear. After the woman left, Clara stood there for a moment, looking around the now empty hall. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long golden beams across the floor. She could almost imagine Harold standing there beside her, quietly smiling like he used to. In the months that followed, the foundation opened new centers in different cities. Each one had a plaque near the entrance with Harold's name and his daughter's favorite phrase, "Be kind anyway." Clara made sure every project reflected the same values she and Harold had shared: humility, compassion, and hope. Though she was constantly busy, she never forgot her roots. She often returned to her old cafe, now managed by a new owner. The place still had the same smell of roasted beans and soft music playing in the background. One morning she walked in, ordered her usual drink, and quietly paid for 10 coffees in advance. "For anyone who needs it," she told the cashier with a wink. That small habit became her tradition. Every month she would visit a random cafe or food stall and pay for strangers' meals, leaving behind a small note that simply said, "Pass it on." One day, as she sat by the cafe window sipping her coffee, she overheard a young man telling his friend, "Did you hear about that foundation lady? They say she used to work at a cafe just like this. She gave coffee to some old man and ended up changing the world." His friend laughed in disbelief. That can't be real. Clara smiled quietly to herself, not saying a word. She didn't need them to know it was her. Sometimes the most powerful stories were the ones left to be discovered by others. As time went on, the Ellis Hope Foundation gained international recognition. News outlets featured their projects, and people began donating from all over the world. Schools, hospitals, and shelters proudly displayed the foundation's logo, a small heart surrounded by rays of light. But even as things grew, Clara kept her focus simple. Every time she met someone in need, she tried to see them as Harold once saw her, with genuine care. No judgment, no expectations. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she went home and sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker below. The streets were alive with people, some rushing, some wandering, some helping others cross the road. Life kept moving, full of small moments that often went unnoticed. She thought back to that rainy morning years ago, the old man on the bench, the umbrella, the steaming cup of coffee. If someone had told her then that her small act of kindness would lead to all this, she would have laughed. It made her wonder how many other hidden stories existed out there, stories waiting to be unlocked by one simple, kind gesture. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the foundation's manager. "We just received approval to open centers in 3 more countries." "Congratulations, Clara," she smiled as she typed back. "It's all thanks to Harold and a cup of coffee." That night, before going to bed, she took the framed letter from her desk and read it again. She had read it countless times before, but it still felt new. His words still carried warmth. "You reminded me that kindness still exists." Clara placed the letter back carefully and whispered into the quiet room, "I hope you know, Harold, that your kindness still exists too. Through every child we help, every meal we serve, and every heart we touch, it's still alive." The next morning she visited the park where she had first met him. The bench was still there, though the paint had started to fade. She sat down, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft shades of gold and pink. The city was just waking up. Birds chirped from the trees, and a cool breeze brushed against her face. She placed a cup of coffee beside her on the bench, just like she had done before. Only this time it wasn't for him. It was for whoever might need it next. A man walking by stopped and looked at her. "Is that for someone?" he asked. Clara smiled. "It's for anyone who needs it." A small reminder that kindness is still free. He nodded thoughtfully and walked away with a faint smile. As the morning light grew stronger, Clara stood up and took one last look at the bench. It no longer felt like a place of loss, it felt like a beginning. The lawyer watched her patiently. "He wanted you to have this," he said softly. sliding a small velvet box across the desk. Clara hesitated before opening it. Inside was a delicate silver locket. It was old, slightly tarnished, but beautiful. Inside the locket was a tiny photo of a young girl with bright eyes and a big smile, Harold's daughter. On the other side, engraved in tiny letters, were the words, "Be kind anyway." Clara closed the locket gently. She didn't know what to say. The reality of it all felt too big to take in. "So he left this foundation in my hands?" she asked quietly. The lawyer nodded. "Yes, it's already been set up legally. You're the named director. Funds have been allocated. He wanted you to continue spreading kindness in his daughter's memory." Clara stared down at the letter again. She could almost hear his voice saying those words. She could see him sitting in his usual corner of the cafe, sipping his coffee slowly, smiling that gentle smile. It was strange to think that a man with so much power and wealth had once sat quietly among strangers, unnoticed, simply looking for a bit of warmth. Later that evening, Clara walked back to the cafe. The place was quiet, the smell of coffee beans still hanging in the air. She sat at one of the tables where he used to sit and placed the locket and the letter on the table in front of her. She thought about the countless mornings she'd served people without really seeing them, rushing to make their drinks, wiping the counter, counting tips. But that one morning she had slowed down long enough to notice someone, and that small moment had changed both of their lives. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Mr. Ellis." Over the next few weeks, her life began to shift in ways she couldn't have imagined. The story of Harold Ellis's hidden generosity began to spread. Reporters tried to contact her, curious about the mystery woman who had somehow reappeared in the Billionaire's final story. Clara avoided interviews. She didn't want attention. She wanted to honor what he had left behind. When the lawyer called again to finalize some documents, he explained the scale of what Harold had arranged. The foundation wasn't just a small charity. It had enough resources to help thousands of people. Students who couldn't afford school, families struggling with bills, shelters that needed support. And she was now at the center of it. It was overwhelming. There were moments she sat alone at night, wondering if she was capable of it all. But then she'd remember what he wrote in that letter. Kindness can't be taught. It lives in the heart. That was enough to keep her going. One morning she walked through the park where she had first seen him sitting alone. The same bench was still there. The same gray pigeons pecked at crumbs. She sat down and placed a single cup of coffee beside her. "I hope you're at peace now," she said quietly, staring at the horizon. "I'll take care of what you left behind. I promise." She stayed there for a while, thinking about how life had a strange way of connecting people. A billionaire and a barista from a small cafe, two completely different worlds linked by a simple act of kindness. As the sun broke through the clouds, Clara stood and took one last look at the bench. She didn't see it as a place of sadness anymore, but as the starting point of something meaningful. That evening, she returned home and placed the letter in a frame on her desk. Below it, she wrote on a sticky note, "Kindness costs nothing but changes everything." She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew this. Harold Ellis's story wasn't over. It was just beginning again, through her. The first few months after Harold Ellis's passing felt like a blur for Clara. Every day brought something new, letters, calls, meetings, and decisions she never thought she'd be making. The foundation that Harold had created was larger than anything she'd ever been part of. It had offices, staff, and an entire network of projects waiting to be launched. At first she felt lost. She had no experience running a foundation or managing millions of dollars. All she had was a simple heart and a promise she made to a man who believed in her kindness. Some nights she would sit in her small apartment, staring at the locket he left her, wondering if she was really the right person for this. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered his words, "And kindness can't be taught. It lives in the heart." One morning, Clara visited the main office of the newly named Ellis Hope Foundation. The building stood tall in the center of the city, its glass doors reflecting the morning light. Inside, people were already busy, answering phones, organizing files, planning outreach programs. Most of them didn't know who she really was. To them, she was just the young woman chosen by the late billionaire to lead his legacy. When she walked into the boardroom for her first official meeting, the room fell silent. There were business professionals, lawyers, and managers, all dressed neatly, all waiting to see what this quiet young woman would say. Clara took a deep breath and began. "I'm not a business expert," she said honestly, "and I don't have a big title or degree, but I do know why this foundation exists. It was built out of love, regret, and hope. So if we're going to honor Harold Ellis's name, then we'll start with compassion before profit and people before paperwork." There was a moment of silence before one of the older men nodded slowly. "Well said," he murmured. And just like that, the tension broke. From that day, Clara poured her heart into her work. She learned fast how to manage teams, how to review proposals, how to decide which causes to support. She visited schools in poor neighborhoods, hospitals short on supplies, and homes where families were struggling to survive. Each time she met someone who needed help, she saw a little bit of her old self in them. The tired eyes, the quiet hope for a better tomorrow. She remembered how it felt to worry about rent, to count coins before payday, to feel invisible in a world that moved too fast. That memory kept her grounded. It reminded her why she was doing all of this. One afternoon, as she was sorting through letters from people asking for assistance, she found one that caught her eye. It was written in shaky handwriting from a small-town teacher. The teacher explained how many of her students came to school hungry, unable to focus. "If we could just get breakfast for them every morning," the letter read, "I know they could do better." Clara folded the letter and smiled. She immediately approved funding for a school breakfast program. Within a month, dozens of schools were part of it. The day she visited one of those schools, she saw children laughing and eating happily, their faces full of life. One of the kids handed her a crayon drawing of a sun and said, "Thank you for the food." That simple moment made her heart swell. It was proof that kindness multiplied. News of the Ellis Hope Foundation began spreading quickly. People were curious about the mysterious woman who had been chosen by the late billionaire. Some journalists tried to dig into her past, wondering if she was related to him. But when they found out she was just a barista from a small cafe, the story became even more powerful. Articles appeared online with headlines like, "The Billionaire and the Barista: How a Simple Act Changed Two Lives." Clara avoided most of the attention, but she couldn't ignore the messages from people all over the world who wrote to say how her story inspired them. Many said they had started helping strangers, donating food, or visiting nursing homes because of it. One evening, as she walked home from the office, she stopped by her old cafe. The familiar bell jingled when she opened the door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee brought back memories of quiet mornings and conversations with the man she once knew as Mr. Ellis. The barista behind the counter looked up and smiled. "You used to work here, right? You're Clara, aren't you?" Clara smiled back. "Yes, that's me. We heard about everything," the barista said. "It's amazing what you've done." "He must have really believed in you." Clara's eyes softened. "He did, more than I believed in myself." She sat at her old corner table, ordered a cup of coffee, and placed the silver locket on the table. For a long time, she just sat there, remembering how it all began, with a rainy morning and a small act of kindness. Later that night, she visited the foundation's storage room, where many of Harold Ellis's personal belongings were kept: old files, photographs, and handwritten notes. She wanted to learn more about the man behind the name, to understand what shaped him before she came into his life. In one of the boxes, she found an old leather journal. The first few pages were filled with business notes and meeting plans. But as she turned further, the tone changed. He had written about his daughter, how she used to bring him coffee in the morning, how she loved drawing little hearts on his papers, how she always reminded him to be kind anyway. Clara's hands trembled as she read those words. The more she read, the more she saw the connection between his daughter and herself. Perhaps that was why he had trusted her so much, because she reminded him of the goodness he once lost. She closed the journal and sat quietly for a while. The room was dim, filled with the scent of old paper and time. She whispered softly, "I'll make sure your story doesn't fade, Harold." Over the next few months, the foundation grew stronger. They opened new projects: scholarships, housing for single mothers, and community centers in small towns. Each project carried Harold's name and Clara's touch of empathy. Years later, long after her story had traveled far and wide, People still spoke about the woman who turned a cup of coffee into a legacy. Schools taught her story to remind students that true greatness isn't about wealth or fame. It's about compassion. Cafes across the country started their own Kind Cup programs, where customers could buy an extra drink for a stranger. And somewhere in the hearts of millions, the message lived on, simple, powerful, eternal. One small act of kindness can unlock more than you can imagine. It can change lives, heal hearts, and remind the world that love still exists. Years had passed since the morning Clara left that cup of coffee on the park bench. The city had changed in many ways. New buildings, new faces, new stories being written every day. But the small park remained much the same. The trees had grown taller, their branches now forming a thick green roof that sheltered the benches below. Children still ran through the grass, people still walked their dogs, and someone always seemed to be sitting quietly by the pond, lost in thought. The Ellis Hope Foundation had grown far beyond what anyone imagined. It was no longer just a local effort. There were branches across continents with schools, hospitals, and shelters all carrying the same symbol of kindness. Yet Clara still believed that the heart of everything they did came from one simple truth. One act of care can change the world, even if you never see it happen. Clara had gotten older. Her hair, once dark and full, was now streaked with silver. Her hands carried the marks of years of work, the kind that came from holding, helping, and building. But her eyes were still bright, and her smile still had that same calm kindness that drew people toward her. One cool autumn afternoon, she sat in her office overlooking the city skyline. The soft hum of conversation came from the team outside her door, busy with plans for a new project. On her desk sat a photograph, not of herself, but of Harold. It was one that had been found years earlier, taken from an old charity archive. In it, he looked younger, standing next to a group of workers at a factory he once owned. His expression was calm but serious, like someone who had seen life's sharp edges yet learned to walk through them with grace. Clara picked up the photo and studied it. "You'd be proud of them," she said quietly. "You started something that's never going to end." There was a knock at her door. A young assistant stepped in holding a few envelopes. "Miss Clara, these just came in from the regional offices." "Oh, and there's one letter addressed to you personally." Clara thanked her, setting the stack aside until she noticed the smaller envelope on top. It looked different. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, written with care but clearly from someone older. She opened it slowly and began to read. "Dear Miss Clara, I don't know if you'll remember me. I used to work for Mr. Ellis many years ago. Back when he ran his company, I was one of the drivers. I remember the day everything changed, when his wife passed away and his daughter left the country. He became quiet after that, not cruel, just distant. We all worried about him. Years later, when I heard about what your foundation was doing in his name, I cried, because I knew the man he really was deep down. I'm glad the world knows now, too. Thank you for reminding people who he truly was." By the time she finished reading, Clara's eyes glistened. She sat in silence for a while, holding the letter close to her heart. It reminded her that stories don't truly end. They just keep unfolding in ways we might never see. Later that week, the foundation announced a new project, the creation of a home for elderly people who had no family left to care for them. It was something Harold had once mentioned in one of his old journals, a dream he never got to complete. Clara decided to call it the Haven, a place where people could live out their days with dignity and companionship. When the building was finished, Clara attended the opening ceremony. She walked through the hallways, greeting residents, listening to their stories. Each room was filled with warmth, pictures on the walls, soft chairs, books, and flowers. There was laughter in every corner. An elderly man sitting by the window called out to her, "You're the lady who started all this, aren't you?" Clara smiled. "I suppose so, but I had help." "A lot of it," he chuckled. "You must have had a good reason to begin something so kind." She looked out the window for a moment before answering. "It started with a cup of coffee," she said softly, "and an old man who reminded me that kindness never dies." The man smiled and nodded slowly as if he understood something deeper. "Well, you gave a lot of people hope, young lady. That's worth more than any fortune." Clara stayed a while longer, talking to the residents. Every story she heard reminded her why she had never stopped. Each person carried years of memories. laughter and pain, yet they all seemed to find peace here. As the evening sun began to fade, she walked outside to the garden behind the home. The air smelled of roses and pine trees. In the center of the garden stood a small bronze statue, a man sitting on a bench holding a cup of coffee in his hand. The plaque beneath it read, "In memory of Harold Ellis, who reminded us that kindness is the truest form of wealth." Clara stood there for a long moment, her eyes filling again. It was not sadness she felt, but something softer, gratitude. In the following months, Clara began receiving invitations to speak at schools and universities. People wanted her to share the story behind the foundation, how it all began. At first she hesitated. She didn't like attention. But then she remembered Harold's words from his letter. The world needs reminders. So she went. She told the story exactly as it happened. A rainy morning, an old man sitting alone and a cup of coffee that led to a friendship no one expected. She spoke of how small gestures could heal unseen wounds, and how the quietest people sometimes carry the loudest stories. Students listened with wide eyes. Some cried, others smiled. Many came up afterward just to say, "Thank you for reminding us what really matters." Those moments were worth more to Clara than any award. One day, years later, Clara visited the park again. She was older now, her steps slower, but her spirit still steady. The same bench was there, freshly painted. Someone had left a cup of coffee on it, just like she once had. A small note was tucked under the cup. It read, "For anyone who needs it, be kind anyway." Clara laughed softly, her eyes bright with tears. "Looks like the message is still traveling," she whispered. She sat down and looked around the park, taking in the sound of laughter, footsteps, and rustling leaves. The world kept moving, but kindness, real, quiet, human kindness, was still alive in it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in gold and orange, Clara leaned back on the bench and closed her eyes. She thought of Harold, of the countless people the foundation had helped, and of all the small acts of kindness happening at that very moment across the world, most of them unseen, unspoken yet powerful beyond measure. When she opened her eyes again, a young girl stood nearby holding a flower. "Excuse me, ma'am," the girl said shyly. "Would you like this?" "My mom says we should always share what's beautiful." Clara took the flower gently and smiled. That's the best thing anyone can do. As the girl ran off, Clara looked at the flower in her hand, a single white daisy. Simple, pure, full of life. She placed it beside the coffee cup and whispered, "It continues." And it did. Long after Clara's story became part of history, people around the world continued to tell it, in schools, cafes, and homes. Some spoke of Harold, others of the woman who turned kindness into a legacy. But the truth they shared was the same. Every act of goodness creates ripples, even when we can't see where they lead. Somewhere on a quiet morning in another city, someone bought an extra cup of coffee for a stranger. Someone paid for a meal, offered a hand, or spoke a kind word. And maybe, just maybe in that moment, they unknowingly carried forward the same spark that began with one simple act of kindness. The one that unlocked a past, healed a heart, and built a future full of hope.